The hammer in Mark Ryland's hand felt like an extension of his own bones. It was a solid, unpretentious weight, a tool for building, for fixing, for making things right. Here, on the skeletal frame of a new house in the sprawling suburbs of Oakville, Ontario, he was the master of his domain. The scent of freshly cut pine and damp earth was his incense, the rhythmic thud of nail gun fire and the distant growl of heavy machinery his liturgy. At 40, his body bore the map of his trade, a slight stiffness in his right shoulder from a decades-old fall, calluses on his palms that no amount of lotion could erase, a permanent tan line on his forearm from his watch. But these were honest marks. They spoke of labor, of tangible results. You built a wall, and it stood. You poured a foundation, and it held. The world of concrete and timber was governed by immutable laws of physics, a stark, merciful contrast to the quicksand of his family. He wiped a bead of sweat from his temple with the back of his glove, his gaze drifting from the intricate web of 2x4s to the quiet street below. In one of these nearly identical, neatly manicured homes, his two children, Liam and Chloe, were likely doing their homework or, more probably, negotiating their daily screen time quota with his wife, Sarah. That life, the one he had painstakingly built board by board, mortgage payment by mortgage payment, was his sanctuary. It was a life of clear boundaries, of promised rewards for finished chores, of bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. It was a life designed to be the absolute inverse of the one he'd been born into. His phone, resting on a sawhorse, buzzed not with a call, but with a cascade of notifications from a family group chat he'd muted months ago. A cold knot, familiar and unwelcome, tightened in his gut. He had tried to disengage. He had set what his therapist, a wonderfully no-nonsense woman named Dr. Evans, called healthy boundaries. They were, in his mind, like the fences he sometimes built for clients, clear, sturdy, and meant to mark where his property ended and another's began. But his family, the Rylands, were master fence jumpers. They treated his boundaries not as walls, but as suggestions, as temporary obstacles to be navigated with a combination of emotional guilt and outright denial. The buzzing phone was a stark reminder of the latest transgression. It had started 2 days ago with a casual, gut-wrenching discovery. Bored on his lunch break, he'd scrolled through Instagram and seen a post from his cousin, Lisa. A vibrant, chaotic photo of his entire extended family, his parents, his younger brother Derek and his wife, aunts, uncles, laughing cousins, gathered around a long table at the keg, festooned with balloons. The caption read, "Happy 65th, Dad. So amazing to have the whole family together to celebrate Grandpa Bill. #family is everything #65 and alive." Mark had stared at the photo, his turkey sandwich turning to ash in his mouth. The whole family. Except for him. Except for Liam and Chloe. He had counted the faces, a childish, pathetic part of him hoping he'd missed someone in the crowd. But no. There was his father, Bill, beaming, his arm around Mark's mother, Carol. There was Derek, smirking right at the camera, a glass of whiskey raised. They had all been there. A planned, coordinated celebration for his father's 65th birthday, and he, the eldest son, had not been told. Not a phone call, not a text, not a whisper. The initial sting was one of pure, unadulterated rejection. It was the feeling of being 12 years old again, standing on the outside of a circle of laughing boys, his brother among them. It was a deep, primal wound. But as the seconds ticked by, the hurt was rapidly eclipsed by a cold, clarifying fury. This wasn't an oversight. This was a message. A punishment. He had called his mother, his voice tight but controlled. "Mom. I saw the pictures. Looks like it was a good party for Dad." There was a beat of silence on the other end, the kind he'd come to recognize as the prelude to a rewrite of history. "Oh, Mark, it was lovely. Such a shame you couldn't make it." "I wasn't aware it was happening," he said flatly. "Don't be silly, dear," she chided, her tone light, airy, expertly laced with condescension. "I'm sure I sent you a message on Facebook. You know how busy I get. You really should check your notifications more often. Besides, you're always so busy with your own little projects. We didn't want to bother you." Your own little projects. That's what she called the business that paid for the roof over his head, the food on his table, the private therapy his brother Derek so desperately needed but would never seek. The same business that, for years, had been the family's unofficial bank. He had paid for Derek's last 2 apartments after Derek's recording career failed to materialize. He covered the insurance on his parents' car. He'd bailed his father out of a bad investment 5 years ago, a sum that had taken 2 years to pay back. His financial success, the result of 16-hour days and sacrificed weekends, was never a source of pride for them, only a resource to be tapped. And his refusal 6 months ago to co-sign a ludicrously risky loan for Derek's latest sure-thing business venture, a high-end sneaker store, had been the catalyst for this new, icy Cold War. The conversation with his mother had devolved from there, a masterclass in what Dr. Evans called gaslighting. He was being oversensitive. He was holding on to grudges. He was trying to make everyone feel bad instead of just letting things go for the sake of family peace. The final blow was her sigh, a performance of long-suffering martyrdom. Your father just wanted a nice, peaceful day, Mark. Without all the drama. He was the drama. His refusal to be a silent, compliant funding source was now categorized as drama. The price of this so-called family peace was his silence, his wallet, and his self-respect. He had hung up, his hands trembling not with sadness, but with a rage so potent it scared him. And now, the buzzing phone. He picked it up. The muted group chat, aptly named Ryland Clan, was exploding. His brother Derek, the golden child, the perpetual victim, had taken the campaign public. He hadn't just posted one photo, he had gone live on Facebook from the party, a video that was now being shared and dissected in the chat. Then came the memes. A picture of a mun looking sour with the text, "When you have to pay your own bills." Another of a brick wall, "Some people just build walls instead of bridges." They were juvenile, pathetic, but their intent was precise and cruel. They were designed to humiliate him, to rally the family against the ungrateful son, the selfish brother. But the deepest cut, the one that transformed his fury into a cold, protective resolve, came via a private message from his son, Liam. "Dad, got a weird message from Grandma. She said she misses us and hopes we're not angry at her and Grandpa. She said she left a letter for me and Chloe at the school office. What's that about?" Mark's vision tunneled. The school. They had gone to his children's school. They had involved Liam and Chloe directly, trying to bypass him entirely, to plant seeds of guilt and confusion in their young minds. This was no longer just about him. This was the emotional shrapnel he had sworn would never touch his children. He saw it all with terrifying clarity, the slow, insidious attempts to turn his kids against him, to use them as leverage, to whisper their twisted narrative into innocent ears. He looked out again at the quiet suburb, at the house that contained his entire world. The peace he felt here, the peace he had built with Sarah, was real. It was earned. It was the peace of truth, not the false, fragile calm of appeasement. The phone in his hand felt alien now, not a tool, but a weapon being used against him. The invisible work of managing his family's toxicity, a lifetime of walking on eggshells and swallowing his pride, was over. The exploitation, financial, emotional, was over. The final brick in his resolve clicked into place. He would not be responding to the messages. He would not be arguing his case. He would be going to the school to retrieve that letter, unopened. He would be sitting down with Liam and Chloe and, with Sarah's steadying presence, explaining in age-appropriate terms why Grandma and Grandpa's behavior was not okay. He would be changing his passwords, his bank details, every point of access they had ever exploited. He slipped the phone into his pocket, the buzzing now a distant, irrelevant insect hum. He hefted his hammer again, feeling its honest weight. He had spent a lifetime building things for other people, houses, financial safety nets, excuses. Now, it was time to fortify his own. The demolition of the old, toxic structure was complete. Now began the harder, more permanent work of building a bulwark to protect what truly mattered. The principal's office of Oak Creek Elementary was a placemark associated with childhood triumphs, science fair ribbons, art contest certificates, the proud, slightly nervous smile of a child who had done something good. Today, it felt like a tribunal. The air smelled of lemon-scented disinfectant and mild anxiety. Mrs. Davison, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, sat behind her desk, holding a plain white envelope as if it were a piece of contaminated evidence. "Mr. Ryland, thank you for coming in so quickly," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We have strict protocols about this sort of thing. Unless it's a prearranged drop-off for a forgotten lunch or medication, we cannot accept items from individuals not on the student's approved pickup list. Ms. Gable at the front desk said your mother was quite insistent." Mark's jaw tightened. He could imagine the scene: his mother, Carol, with her best concerned grandmother act, a performance of sweet fragility designed to bend rules and wills. "I apologize for any inconvenience, Mrs. Davison. My parents. We are currently navigating some family difficulties. They are not to have any contact with Liam and Chloe at school, or to leave them anything. I will be providing you with a formal, written directive to that effect by the end of the day." "I understand," Mrs. Davison said, her gaze softening a fraction. She slid the envelope across the desk. "She said it was a birthday card for Liam. His birthday isn't for another 3 months." Of course it is, Mark thought. A preemptive strike, laden with unspoken implications. "See? We remember your birthday, even if your father is keeping us from you." He took the envelope. It was light, but it felt leaden in his hand, a payload of pure emotional poison. "Thank you for your discretion." He didn't open it until he was sealed inside the cab of his Ford F-150, the familiar scent of old coffee and clean dirt a small comfort. The card was generic, a cartoon dog holding a balloon. Inside, his mother's looping, elegant script belied the message's ugliness. "My dearest Liam. Your grandpa and I miss you and your sister so much it hurts. We think of you every single day and hope you are both happy and well. We're so sorry if we've done anything to make your daddy upset with us. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, and it makes us all very sad. We hope you know that our love for you is forever and has no conditions. We will always be here for you, no matter what. Can't wait to see you soon and give you a big hug. All our love. Grandma and Grandpa." Mark crushed the card in his fist, a raw, guttural sound escaping his throat. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. The wounded tone, the passive-aggressive apology, the portrayal of him as the unreasonable obstacle standing between them and their unconditional love. It was all there, perfectly calibrated to make a 9-year-old boy feel confused, guilty, and responsible for the adult's pain. No conditions? The condition was his capitulation. The price was his silence. He drove home in a fog of white-hot rage, the card a burning brand in his pocket. When he pulled into the driveway, the sight of his own home, the porch light Sarah had left on for him, the bike lying on its side in the grass, acted as an anchor. This was what he was fighting for. He found Sarah in the home office, staring at her laptop with a grim expression. She looked up as he entered, her eyes immediately reading the storm on his face. "You got it." He tossed the crumpled card onto the desk. "Read it. A masterclass in grandparental guilt-tripping." Sarah read it, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finished, she let out a long, slow breath. "Oh, Mark. This is low. Even for them." She got up and wrapped her arms around him. He leaned into her solidity, drawing strength from her calm, unwavering presence. "We need to talk to the kids. Tonight. Before this poison has time to set in." They waited until after dinner, after the dishes were cleared and the familiar evening routine had provided a layer of normalcy. In the living room, with Liam building a Lego spaceship and Chloe coloring, Mark turned off the television. "Guys, can we talk for a minute?" he began, his voice softer than he felt inside. "About Grandma and Grandpa." Liam immediately looked up, his expression guarded. "Did you get the letter? Grandma said she was leaving me one." "I did, buddy. And I read it." Mark chose his words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. You know how sometimes, when people are upset, they say things that aren't entirely true, or they try to make you feel a certain way? Chloe, ever perceptive for a 6-year-old, put down her crayon. Like when Tommy Miller said he wouldn't be my friend if I didn't give him my cookie? A little like that, sweetie, Sarah said, smiling gently. Sometimes grown-ups do that too. Grandma and Grandpa are very upset with Dad and me right now about some grown-up problems. And because they're upset, they might say things to you that are confusing, or that might make you feel like you have to choose sides. But you never, ever have to choose. Dad and I love you, and Grandma and Grandpa love you. That will never change. But the letter said they were sorry, Liam said, his brow furrowed in confusion. Why are you still mad? Mark's heart ached. This was the gaslighting in action, its tendrils already seeking purchase in his son's mind. They said they were sorry if they did something, Liam. That's not a real apology. A real apology is when you say what you did wrong, and you promise not to do it again. They haven't done that. They've done things that hurt our family, and instead of talking to me about it like a grown-up, they tried to send a secret message to you. That's not fair to you, and it's not okay. He looked at their young, earnest faces, and a ferocious protectiveness surged within him. So, here's the new rule. For a little while, we're not going to see Grandma and Grandpa. No visits, no phone calls. And if they try to contact you at school, or send you another letter, you come and tell Mom or me right away, okay? You don't have to worry about any of this. That's our job. Your job is to be kids. Lily seemed to accept this with a child's pragmatism, already reaching for her crayon again. Liam looked more thoughtful, but eventually nodded. Okay, Dad. For a few days, a fragile peace settled over the Ryland household. Mark sent the formal no-contact email to the school. He and Sarah changed the passwords on their shared streaming services, a small but symbolic act. He even mustered the courage to formally withdraw from the Ryland clan group chat, a move that felt like cutting a tether to a sinking ship. The silence from his family was deafening, but he mistook it for acceptance. He was naive. The first breach came on a rainy Thursday. Sarah called him, her voice tight with alarm. Mark, my Netflix account was logged into from Sudbury. They must have guessed my new password. They're watching some true crime documentary. A cold fury washed over him. It was a petty, invasive act, a digital trespass meant to say, we are still here. We can still get in. He immediately logged out all devices and enabled two-factor authentication. It felt like building a higher fence, only to look over and see them already inside, smirking. The next violation was more serious. A week later, a registered letter arrived from a law firm representing his brother, Derek. It was a formal, aggressively worded notice of intent regarding their late grandmother's estate. It claimed that a vintage Rolex watch, which had been in Mark's possession for over a decade, a gift from his grandmother on his 21st birthday for getting his Red Seal certification, was allegedly promised to Derek. The letter demanded its return within 30 days or they would pursue all available legal remedies. It was a blatant, malicious fiction. His grandmother had despised Derek's shiftlessness. But it was a masterstroke of financial and emotional exploitation. It was a move designed to drain him, financially through legal fees, and emotionally by dragging the memory of his beloved grandmother into their squalid conflict. That evening, as he and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the lawyer's letter lying between them like a declaration of war, the doorbell rang. The rain was sheeting down now, a cold, late autumn deluge. Through the peephole, Mark saw his father, Bill, standing on the porch, his jacket soaked, his face a mask of thunderous rage. Mark's entire body went rigid. "It's my father," he said quietly to Sarah. "Don't answer it," she urged, her hand on his arm. "I have to," Mark said, his voice low. "If I don't, he'll stand out there all night, making a scene. He'll think he's won." He opened the door, but didn't step aside to invite him in. The barrier of the threshold felt crucial. Dad. Bill Ryland was a large man, though age had softened his frame. He had once been a foreman, and he carried himself with the bluster of a man used to being obeyed. His face was flushed, his eyes blazing. "So, this is how it is?" Bill snarled, ignoring the rain soaking his shoulders. You don't answer your mother's calls? You send lawyers' letters to your own brother? You turn my own grandchildren against me. The sheer audacity of it, the complete and total rewriting of reality, stole Mark's breath for a moment. They had sent the lawyer. They had involved the children. There's no lawyer from me, Dad. Derek sent one to me. And we are not discussing this on the porch. You need to leave. Leave. Bill barked a harsh, disbelieving laugh. I'm your father. I'm not some salesman. We're family. Your mother is sick with worry. She can't sleep, she can't eat. Is that what you want? To destroy your own mother? The emotional shrapnel was flying. The guilt trip, the exaggeration, the casting of him as the villain tormenting his poor, fragile mother. It was a script he knew by heart. What I want, Mark said, his voice dangerously calm, is for you to respect my family. My wife, my children, and my home. You crossed a line going to their school. You crossed a line with that letter to Liam. And Derek has crossed a line with this fiction about Nana's watch. It's not a fiction, his father roared, taking a step forward. Mark stood his ground, blocking the doorway. That watch is a family heirloom. It should stay in the family, not be sold off to pay for your pretentious little life here. And there it was. The true, festering resentment. His success was not a source of pride, it was a personal insult to them. It was pretentious. The watch was a gift to me, Mark said, each word measured and cold. From Nana. It is mine. And this conversation is over. You will leave my property now. If you don't, I will call the police. The word police hung in the air between them, a nuclear option. Bill's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. The concept that his authority could be challenged so directly, that his son would dare invoke the law against him, was utterly alien. You would call the cops on your own father? He whispered, the rage momentarily replaced by a look of genuine, wounded incomprehension. To protect my family? Mark met his gaze, unblinking. Yes. Without a second thought. For a long moment, they stood frozen in the tableau, the furious, rain-drenched father on the porch, the resolute son in the doorway. The sounds of the storm and the faint chatter of the television from inside were the only noises. Mark could see the calculations going on behind his father's eyes, the bluster, the threat, the realization that his usual tactics had failed completely. With a sound of pure disgust, Bill Ryland turned abruptly. You've changed, Mark. You're not the son I raised. He stomped down the porch steps and disappeared into the rainy darkness, his silhouette swallowed by the night. Mark closed the door slowly, his hand trembling as he engaged the deadbolt. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He heard Sarah's footsteps behind him. You okay? She asked softly. He turned to face her. He saw the concern in her eyes, but also a fierce pride. He had done it. He had held the line. He had faced the dragon at the gate and not been consumed. No, he said honestly, his voice rough. But I will be. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the empty, rain-swept street. The war wasn't over. The legal threat over the watch still loomed. The campaign of whispers and manipulation would undoubtedly continue. But something fundamental had shifted. The invisible cage he had lived in for 40 years was gone. He had chosen the messy, painful truth of this confrontation over the suffocating lie of family peace. The cost was high, and the ache of that loss was a fresh wound. But as he felt Sarah's hand slip into his, and heard the innocent, unfettered laughter of his children from the living room, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was a price worth paying. The foundation he had just poured for his own life, for his real family, was finally, unshakably, solid. The silence that followed his father's retreat was not peaceful, but it was potent. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first, decisive clash, a space thick with the echoes of what had been said and the grim understanding of what was yet to come. Mark stood by the window long after his father's taillights had vanished, watching the rain trace frantic paths down the glass. The trembling in his hands had subsided, replaced by a strange, hollowed-out calm. He had done the unthinkable. He had drawn a line in the sand of his own doorstep and had held it against the one man he'd been taught to never challenge. Sarah came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice muffled by his shirt. He covered her hands with his own, anchoring himself in her touch. "He'll tell everyone I threatened to call the police on him," Mark said, the statement flat, a simple prediction of fact. "I'll be the monster who terrified his own mother and sicked the cops on his poor, heartbroken father." "Let him," Sarah replied, her tone steely. "The people who matter know the truth. We know the truth." The next few weeks were a study in grim fortification. Mark hired a lawyer, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Anya Sharma, to respond to Derek's absurd claim about the watch. Anya's letter was a thing of beauty, terse, dismissive, and legally airtight. It cited the statute of limitations on challenging personal property gifts. Included a notarized copy of his grandmother's will which made no mention of the watch, and concluded with a stern warning about pursuing frivolous litigation and the potential for Derek to be held liable for Mark's legal fees. It was a financial and legal checkmate. The bluster from Derek's side evaporated into a sullen, silent retreat. The watch stayed on Mark's dresser, its meaning transformed from a token of affection to a trophy of a battle he hadn't wanted but had been forced to win. The family-wide smear campaign, however, went into overdrive. Aunts and uncles he hadn't heard from in years sent him long, chastising emails, parroting the party line fed to them by his parents. "Family is everything, Mark. Your mother is on sedatives, is that what you wanted? Can't you just be the bigger man and apologize to keep the peace?" He didn't engage. He followed Anya Sharma's and Dr. Evans's identical advice. He did not jade, justify, argue, defend, or explain. His responses, when he sent them at all, were brief and unassailable. "This is a private matter between me and my immediate family. I will not be discussing it further." He blocked the numbers of the most persistent relatives. He finally, permanently, deleted his Facebook account, severing the last public tether to their narrative. It was emotionally exhausting, like constantly bailing water from a leaking boat, but with each ignored provocation, each unanswered guilt trip, he felt a little stronger. The muscle of his resolve, long atrophied from disuse, was being rebuilt, rep by painful rep. The true test, the moment that solidified everything, came just before Christmas. It was a bleak, gray Saturday afternoon. The children were playing in the living room, and Mark and Sarah were stringing lights on the tree, trying to cultivate a sense of normal festive cheer. The doorbell rang. A collective tension seized the room. Liam's eyes flickered nervously towards the door. Sarah's hands stilled, a string of tiny white lights dangling from her fingers. "I'll get it," Mark said, his voice calm. He looked through the peephole. It was his mother, Carol. She stood alone on the porch, looking small and fragile in a stylish winter coat, her hands clasped demurely in front of her. She had not come with the blustering storm of his father, but with the quiet, calculated force of a siege engine. This was the emotional cavalry. He opened the door. "Mom." "Mark, darling," she said, her voice a practiced tremolo. She made no move to come in, playing the role of the supplicant perfectly. I was in the neighborhood. I just wanted to see you. To see the children. It's been so long." Her eyes welled with tears that seemed to appear on command. "Can't we just put this all behind us? For Christmas? The thought of you all being alone on Christmas. It's breaking my heart." It was a perfectly executed performance. The vulnerability, the appeal to tradition, the unspoken accusation that he was the one causing this heartbreak. The old Mark would have crumbled. The old Mark would have seen her tears and felt the crushing weight of responsibility, would have rushed to comfort her and assure her everything was okay, just to stop the pain, hers and, by proxy, his own. But the old Mark was gone. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him to shield his children from the scene. The cold air was a shock. "We won't be alone, Mom," he said, his voice even. "We'll be together. As a family. The four of us. She flinched as if he'd struck her. The tears began to fall in earnest now. But that's not a real family Christmas. Don't you see what you're doing? You're punishing all of us. You're punishing me for things I don't even understand. What have I done that was so terrible? Loved my grandchildren? Wanted to see them. This was the core of the gaslighting, the complete and total refusal to acknowledge any specific wrongdoing, the retreat into a generalized, wounded innocence. What have I done? The school letter, the Netflix, the lawyer, the porchside confrontation, it was all swept away into the vague ether of his unreasonable anger. He didn't take the bait. He didn't list her sins. He simply stated his reality. What you have done, Mom, is consistently disrespect me, my wife, and the boundaries we have set to protect our children. You tried to manipulate Liam with a letter. You and Dad have harassed us and slandered us to the entire family. Until that stops, until there is a genuine, unqualified apology and a demonstrable change in behavior, this is how it has to be. Her face hardened then, the tears drying up as if by magic. The mask of the wounded mother slipped, revealing the core of steel beneath. An apology? You want me to apologize to you? After you've put us through this hell? After you threatened your own father with the police? She shook her head, her expression morphing into one of pure, cold disdain. You are a bitter, unforgiving man, Mark. And you are poisoning my grandchildren against us. I hope you're happy with your peace, because this is a war you cannot win. With that, she turned and walked back to her car, her posture rigid with outrage. Mark watched her go, feeling a final, definitive severance. There was no reconciliation here. There was no middle ground. There was only their demand for total submission, and his refusal to provide it. He went back inside. The warm, fragrant air of the house felt like a sanctuary he had successfully defended. Sarah was waiting for him, her question silent in her eyes. It was Mom, he said. She wanted to put it all behind us for Christmas. And? Sarah asked softly. And I told her no. He looked towards the living room, where Liam and Chloe were now tentatively resuming their play. I told her the truth. He walked over to the Christmas tree and picked up the string of lights Sarah had dropped. His hands were steady. The hollow feeling was gone, replaced by a profound and solid certainty. The cost of this piece was the family of his birth. It was a staggering loss, a void that would likely never be filled. He would grieve it, in time. But the price of their peace had been his soul, his self-respect, and the emotional safety of his wife and children. That was a price he would never pay again. He plugged in the lights. The tree, once a bare, dark skeleton, suddenly blazed with 100 tiny, brilliant points of light, illuminating the room, the children's faces, the solid, loving gaze of his wife. It was not the peace of silence and surrender. It was the peace that comes after the storm has passed, earned, fragile, and more valuable than anything he had ever built with his hands. It was his. The snow in Halliburton was a different creature altogether from the wet, slushy mess of the Oakville suburbs. Here, it lay thick and pristine over the evergreens, muffling the world in a profound, sacred silence. It was the silence of absence, but not a lonely one. It was a silence Mark had learned to fill with the sounds that truly mattered. The crackle of pine logs in the stone fireplace, the soft jazz Sarah played on the speaker, the delighted shrieks of Chloe and Liam careening down the gentle slope behind the cabin on new snow tubes. They had started this new tradition the first Christmas after the rupture, as Sarah had privately come to think of it. No more frantic, performative joy of the Ryland family's overcrowded, tension-filled gatherings. This was their own. A week in a rented cabin, just the four of them. It was a declaration of independence, written in snow and sealed with hot chocolate. Mark stood at the large kitchen window, watching his children. Liam, now 11, was trying to build a jump out of a packed snowdrift, his focus absolute. Chloe, at 8, was a pink and purple bundle of relentless energy, already scrambling back up the hill for another run. He saw Liam stop to help her untangle the tube's rope from her boot, a simple, unconscious act of brotherly kindness. There were no whispered comparisons from a grandparent, no favoritism to navigate, no undercurrent of tension waiting to pull them under. Their childhood was allowed to be just that, childhood. The journey to this peace had been neither quick nor linear. The first 6 months had been the hardest. The phantom limb of his old family had ached constantly. He'd catch himself reaching for his phone to tell his father about a tricky structural problem he'd solved on a job, or to share a funny story about Chloe with his mother. The guilt had been a persistent ghost, whispering that he was selfish, that he had destroyed his family, that he was the problem. Therapy with Dr. Evans had given him the tools to silence that ghost. She had reframed his actions not as destruction, but as construction. You are not dismantling a family, Mark. You are building a healthy one. Sometimes, that requires removing toxic materials from the site. He had learned to recognize the patterns, to name the manipulations for what they were, and most importantly, to stop seeking a validation from his parents that they were fundamentally incapable of giving. There had been a few, final attempts at contact. A guilt-ridden email from an aunt, forwarded from his mother, detailing a minor health scare that was heavily implied to be his fault. He had not responded. A birthday card for Liam arrived at their old address, forwarded by the new owners. Sarah had intercepted it, and with Mark's calm approval, had discarded it unopened. They were no longer engaging in the dance. The music had stopped, and they had left the ballroom. The most significant change, however, had been internal. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been the soundtrack of his life had faded away. The tension in his shoulders, which he had accepted as a permanent state of being, was gone. He slept through the night. He was more present with Sarah, their relationship deepening in the space that was no longer crowded out by family drama. He was a more patient, more engaged father. He was building a life, not just managing a crisis. Sarah came to stand beside him, slipping her arm around his waist and handing him a mug of coffee. "They're going to be exhausted," she said, smiling as Chloe took a spectacular, fluffy tumble off her tube, laughing uncontrollably. "Good," Mark replied, taking a sip. "Means they'll actually go to bed on time for once." He looked down at her, at the fine lines around her eyes that spoke more of laughter than of worry these days. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For this. For them. For not letting me give in." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We built this together, Mark. We held the line." And they had. The financial exploitation had ended. His money was his own, funding this cabin, their savings, the children's education funds. The emotional shrapnel had, for the most part, been deflected. The children occasionally asked about their grandparents, the questions becoming less frequent and more historical, like inquiring about a character from a storybook they'd long since closed. Their answers were always the same, a mantra of gentle truth: "They love you very much, but the way they behave isn't healthy for our family, so we don't see them right now." There was no anger in it anymore, only fact. He thought of his parents sometimes, a distant, melancholy thought. He hoped, in his more generous moments, that they had found some measure of peace in their own version of reality, one where they were the wrong parties. But their peace was no longer his responsibility. His responsibility was to the people in this warm, lit cabin, to the laughter echoing in the cold air outside, to the integrity of the life he had chosen to build. Later that evening, with the children finally asleep, exhausted and pink-cheeked from the cold, Mark and Sarah sat on the sofa in front of the roaring fire. The only light came from the flames, dancing shadows on the log walls. "Do you ever wonder what they're doing right now?" Sarah asked softly, her head in his lap. Mark looked into the fire, watching a log shift and send a shower of sparks up the chimney. He thought of the chaotic, loud Christmases of his past, the forced smiles, the underlying tension, the feeling of being an actor in a play whose script he despised. "No," he said, and the word was utterly, completely true. There was no bitterness in it, no curiosity, only a final, quiet closure. "I don't." He stroked her hair, his gaze moving from the fire to the darkened window, where the moon was rising over the silent, snow-blanketed forest. The world outside was vast and still. The world inside was warm and whole. The fences he had built were no longer fortifications against an invading army. They were simply the markers of his own domain, a territory of peace that he had won, not through surrender, but through the courageous, painful, and ultimately liberating act of walking away. He had paid the price, and he had finally received something of immeasurable value in return: himself. The final, quiet severance didn't come with a dramatic letter or a final, shouting match. It arrived with the simple, bureaucratic permanence of a registered document. About a year after the cabin trip, a thick envelope arrived from Anya Sharma's law firm. Inside was a copy of his father's will. A brief, accompanying note from Anya explained it had been filed as a matter of public record upon probate, and as a former potential beneficiary, her firm routinely tracked such things. Mark sat at his desk in the home office, the afternoon sun streaming in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He read the document with a detached, clinical curiosity. His father, William Ryland, had left everything: the house, his savings, his investments, in a trust. The trustee and sole beneficiary was his brother, Derek. There was a single clause concerning Mark: "I have intentionally made no provision for my son, Mark William Ryland, as he has chosen to separate himself from this family and is capable of providing for himself." He felt the words, but they had no sharp edges. They were a confirmation, not an injury. This was the final, legal codification of the narrative they had constructed: he was the estranged, ungrateful son who had turned his back on them. The will was their ultimate act of gaslighting, an attempt to etch their version of reality into the permanence of law. He had chosen to separate. His capability, his success born of hard work, was now being used as a justification for his disinheritance. He thought he might feel anger, or a fresh wave of grief. Instead, he felt a profound, almost unsettling, sense of closure. This was the final piece of the puzzle, snapping into place. It laid bare the transactional nature of their love. His place in the family had always been conditional on his utility and his compliance. The moment he ceased to be useful and compliant, he was legally, formally erased. Sarah found him there later, the document still open on his desk. She read it, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Mark. I'm so sorry. This is vile." He looked up at her and smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached his eyes. "Don't be. Really. Look." He tapped the paper. "This is them telling me, in their most official voice, that I was right. There was never any real love here, only a balance sheet. I was an asset. I became a liability. Now, I'm written off." He shook his head, a weight he hadn't even known he was still carrying finally lifting from his shoulders. "This isn't a punishment, Sarah. It's my release." He stood up, folded the document, and slid it back into the envelope. He walked to the filing cabinet in the corner, pulled out a drawer labeled Archives Legal, and tucked it away behind older tax returns. It was not a place of honor, but of record. It was evidence of a journey he had completed. That night, after the kids were in bed, he and Sarah sat on the back porch, watching the fireflies blink in the warm summer darkness. The air was sweet with the scent of cut grass and blooming lilacs. "It's really over, isn't it?" Sarah said softly, lacing her fingers through his. "It's been over for a long time," Mark replied. This was just the period at the end of the sentence. He thought about the journey, the pain of the birthday party exclusion, the fury at the letter to Liam, the cold confrontation with his father on the rain-lashed porch, the calculated tears of his mother. He thought of the cost, the loss of a shared history, the extended family his children would never know, the cultural myth of unconditional parental love he had to finally relinquish. But then he tallied the gains, and the balance was overwhelmingly, unequivocally, in his favor. The gain was the peace in his own home. It was the sound of his children's laughter, untainted by manipulation or favoritism. It was the deep, trusting partnership with his wife, no longer strained by external chaos. It was the quiet confidence in his own mind, no longer questioning his own perception of reality. It was the energy he once spent managing his family's toxicity, now redirected into building a business he loved, a home he adored, and a self he could respect. The ultimate conclusion was not a dramatic victory, but a quiet, hard-won wisdom. He had learned that some bridges need to be burned, not because you want to, but because the land on the other side is poisonous and the toll to cross is your very soul. He learned that family is not a title bestowed by blood, but a role earned through respect, kindness, and mutual support. He had built his own family, and in doing so, he had finally, fully, come home to himself. The fireflies continued their silent, luminous dance in the gathering dark. Mark squeezed Sarah's hand, a silent communication of a shared life, a shared survival, a shared future. There was no more anger, no more guilt, no more looking back. There was only the quiet, profound gratitude for the peace he had fought for, and the unshakable knowledge that he was finally, and forever, free.